So what is knowledge? Not can we know anything, and not what do I know, but what is knowledge? One of the most fundamental things in philosophy is what can be called conceptual analysis. In some of my last videos, I described philosophy as a kind of conceptual engineering. And in fact, there's a kind of reverse conceptual engineering that goes on in sort of working out what someone else thinks, or even what a book is saying, or even what a conversation might mean. But that's neither here nor there, because what we want to do is conceptual analysis. And we're going to begin sort of meta with a conceptual analysis with the question, what is knowledge? We take it for granted that we have knowledge. We don't even use that word because in many respects we just assume that we know what we know. But philosophy, at least modern philosophy, begins with these questions that are really easy to take for granted. But once you no longer take them for granted, these questions begin to open up what appears at first to be a dangerous antithesis of what we know will actually turn out to be a wonderful way of grounding ourselves in what I think of as a superior way of thinking, which is philosophical thinking, which in fact isn't thinking itself in that it doesn't carry a set of beliefs or ideas, but it's an approach to thinking. And it's an approach, as I've described, that is philosophical thinking, as being somewhere between mathematics and music. Both mathematics and music are without content. They don't have knowledge as disciplines. They don't contain knowledge. Music and mathematics teach a methodology or an approach. So mathematics and music are both processes. And I think that philosophy has something in common with that. And that's precisely what I'm hoping to do today as I navigate the complexities of this fundamental question, what is knowledge? And I mentioned conceptual engineering because on a certain level, to use that phrase, ironically, on a certain level, when one thinks philosophically, you're sort of practicing a kind of engineering that is like going into the basements or going into the upper attics of the familiar rooms and spaces we typically inhabit. That is, we begin to investigate the tacit assumptions and presuppositions in our own beliefs. We investigate the underlying architecture of our minds in the way that you might investigate a tree's roots as a way of trying to grasp the tree itself. And I'm not trying to be flowery, but I'm meaning to suggest that we often assume that we know things. And of course, we take our beliefs to be true. That's one of the interesting things about belief. But rarely do we think about how it is that we arrive at our beliefs, how it is that we would justify our beliefs. Of course, many of us can justify our beliefs quite well, but rarely are we taught in a way that sticks ways of considering what might count as knowledge, which would honor the nature of truth itself. So I'm not speaking in a neutral way. I'm speaking in a biased way. That is, I am tenuously loyal to what's called the Western philosophical tradition. Not that I'm not open or in fact influenced by many other ways of thinking, but what I mean to suggest is that we're often completely lost in a world that is from every level and in every direction telling us what to think. We almost make no distinction between what is shit and what is shinola. We rarely make a distinction in regards to superior ways of knowing. And some of this has to do with being Americans and being anti-European in our bones. And that is not an unhealthy thing insofar as this means being anti-aristocratic, anti-aristocracy. And not an aristocracy in land ownership, but the kind of aristocracy that presumes itself to know things simply because they're born into a superior position. This can be called aristocentrism. And so as Americans, we've really ripped this out of our identity, and we're much more anarchic or libertarian, as they might say, in that regard. But what this prevents us from doing, unfortunately, is seeing that there is a problem with democracy insofar as it has negated every possibility of there being a better way of thinking, or a more nuanced way or superior way of thinking, which ironically you come to find that the more inspiring people already have working in their being. But anyways, the question of what is knowledge is the kind of question that you ask when you're beginning to commit to this kind of path. That is the path to truth, the path to knowing. Because a part of what you have to do when you think philosophically, and a part of what I mean by being loyal to that tradition, and the reason I bring it up, is that before one can think, one has to learn certain protocol. One has to learn certain maneuvers. And these might appear arbitrary and might appear as mere authority, like, oh, it's just a dead white guy tradition imposing its vision of what counts as truth and what is right upon us, therefore disclosing a hidden ideological structure. I'm familiar with that kind of thinking, but we're sort of bracketing all of that. And I'm bracketing my own opinions in regards even to what knowledge is, in order to think clearly about this question. What is knowledge? But it's a formalized question, because we're using a kind of methodology in approaching the question of what is knowledge. And when we begin with the helpful questions, the things that are really meaningful when we're thinking about how it is that we would question someone else's knowledge, or how we would question what counts as knowledge for us. And by knowledge, I really mean everything. And knowledge is like a precondition for truth, right? We assume that what is true is knowable, and we assume that what is logical, and not only that we assume what is logical is knowledge. And so we assume that what is good in many ways is knowable. But to question the very foundations of that in a dangerous, open-ended way is to practice philosophy. And in many ways, what you might come to find is that there isn't the kind of foundation for philosophy that we assume when we enter it. And so we're not having a tradition imposed upon us in learning these fundamental questions and ideas. What we're actually being offered is a way of saving time, is a way of attuning ourselves to the greatest thoughts that have ever been thought. And that's not merely a negative thing, because insofar as we open ourselves up to what is going on in Plato and Kant, we almost, like a form of osmosis, become more expansive beings. And that's why to bring up these distinctions is to bring up particular ideas that haven't met that philosophy has progressed historically, but that there are certain tools from that tradition that we can use in our own desire, in our own projects of pursuing knowledge and ultimately wisdom and truth. And so that distinction is between what would count as knowledge. And the two words are necessary and sufficient. In other words, what are the necessary conditions of knowledge on the one hand, and what are the sufficient conditions of knowledge on the other hand? It sounds like gibberish, but what this simply means is that what would have to be the case for you yourself to have knowledge, to know things, even without understanding, right? But having a kind of intuitive knowledge of things. In many ways, that might count as a necessary condition of knowing. Now, sufficient conditions of knowing in many ways have to do with certainty. So those are questions of knowledge that would determine a kind of absolute truth in that assertion. So you can see that the question of knowledge, what is knowledge, It's sort of like a horizon itself. And another word for that horizon is veracity. Things are not on and off in the sense that they're true or not true, even though they are. But when it comes to the question of knowledge, rather than being on or off, true or not true, it's not mere relativity, right? It's not admitting defeat, but it's the sense that there are degrees of truth. There are certain degrees of truth. And by veracity, there's another word that's related, which is, I think, atopic. No, I'm misspeaking. It's the word that refers to something that is approaching a horizon and never, in fact, reaches it. I think it's asymptotic is the word. But anyways, that's what I get for thinking aloud, thinking spontaneously. You know, because I think the key thing about what I'm doing in these introductory lectures, or not lectures, but sort of open-ended conversations about what philosophy is that I'm trying to do philosophy at the same time that I introduce it. I think that's one thing that separates me from the huge amount of YouTubers and content creators. They're all talking about philosophy, but they're not necessarily doing philosophy. In many ways, they see that as a limitation in the ability to teach. But I see it as something that is more akin to music, and that people pick up on it and begin to philosophize themselves, because there's an inherent anarchic quality to philosophizing that means that my point of view is exactly that, just another point of view. But again, that's not mere relativism, you know. It's really just something that's perhaps more subtle even than that. And so, in regards to the question of knowledge, what we're doing is following a path that began with my other video in regards to skepticism. You know, I'd made a number of videos about what philosophy is, and I can speak for a long time about what philosophy means and how important it is and how powerful and dangerous it is. But it's another thing to, as I say, do philosophy. And so that's precisely what I was trying to do in introducing the question of skepticism in my first video. So there is a chaotic, almost inchoate quality to it, but that's the price I pay for attempting the vulnerability, for attempting the open-endedness of thinking itself, thinking on the spot. Hence the fact that I'm walking without notes. Even though I'm embarrassing myself, I'm sort of honoring that tradition, except that I'm recording it, you know, hoping that, like, mimetically, other people will mirror it and pick up on it. But anyways, when it comes to the question of knowledge, we're sort of practicing something that is so fundamental that it's almost boring. It almost appears like unnecessary, especially given that I've already spoken 13 minutes about it without really even getting into it. The question of knowledge has to do with sufficient and necessary conditions. And as I said, not to give away the plot, but no one has access to sufficient conditions of knowledge itself. That's precisely what is at the heart of modernity, and that's why I mentioned this kind of discussion as the beginning of modern philosophy itself. But when it comes to, as I said, the fact that it's not merely on or off, yes or no, the truth is we can still function perfectly fine and have really great lives without sufficient certainty, without sufficient means of knowing. You know, when you look back at the history of philosophy, you see that the fundamental idea that begins with Plato regarding the concept of knowledge is that knowledge itself is defined as true, believable, justifiable. True justifiable belief. Meaning that for something to be known, the necessary condition of knowing is that it must be true, it must be believed, and it must be justified. That's how it was understood until the modern tradition. And it might seem so obvious that it goes without saying that you would take your belief to be true. Because one funny thing about belief is that you can't will or talk yourself into believing something that you don't think is true. There is such a thing as willful thinking, there is such a thing as hopeful thinking, but there's an inherent determinant quality, which is that what each person believes, they truly believe. So truth and belief are linked. And it's easy to overlook this and just go on, but if you spend time considering what this is, especially in regards to the fact that we are in the basement of philosophy, in regards to engineering, we are looking at the underlying assumptions and sort of the parts and pieces of our thinking lives. We are going into that basement. We're sort of learning the ins and outs of what thinking is so that we can do it better, or so that we can free ourselves from it. And one of the fundamental features in this basement is the question of truth and the question of belief. And when we go back to Plato, who begins this kind of discussion, which he was very optimistic about. Plato believed that we would have access to absolute truth, and so in many ways wasn't bothered by what we take for granted as being highly questionable. And if it is highly questionable in regards to what Plato is suggesting, then knowledge itself is suspended and highly questionable. And so that in itself is a momentous, explosive kind of realization. And I don't know if it makes sense to you like it does to me, but it sort of points out the connection between what is seen as inane or quiet about philosophical thinking, but turns out to be the most effective thing one can do, the most powerful thing one can do, that the consequences of it can mean so many things. Because if you believe, which you can't will yourself out of, that there's no such thing as truth, that there's no such thing as knowledge, the consequences for your life are radically different. And I'm not saying that either is good or bad. I'm not saying that I believe in truth or knowledge, but that one must see the consequences of your choice to think that what you know is shaped by certain preconditions that you can, of course, assume to be unnecessary in terms of investigation. They might appear to you to be unworthy of attention, but that simply means that you're a bad philosopher, that you're doing bad philosophy, because you might think that you don't have to have philosophical beliefs, but you always already do. And yet, ironically, it might not mean anything for your life. So it's not that philosophy is necessary, but that there's something that has to be celebrated and almost warned against in regards to philosophical speculation of this kind, because it's sort of like precisely the engineers and those that are living in the basements who are the most dangerous, right? The secretaries and the janitors. And so maybe that's those are sort of some helpful analogies for thinking about philosophy as the secretary, as the janitor, but also as the engineer, as the maintenance engineer. When I was in high school, every summer for 3 months, I would get up at 6 a.m. to work as a maintenance engineer at my high school. And so that's when that word first entered my lexicon, maintenance engineer, because it's sort of like an insult to the kind of work that you actually do. But it's sort of like a title that's supposed to make you feel better about what you're doing. The irony is something I, of course, noticed. But I, at the time, began to think in a very distant way that perhaps there was something to be said for living in the basements of institutions, that is, working with the underlying mechanics and the underlying foundational structures that would make up a discipline and make it what it is, or a practice, because that's precisely what philosophical thinking is. And the thing that I had mentioned also is that not only is a belief true and believed, or we assume it is, but it has to be justifiable. That's one thing that separates certain traditions from others, which is that it's not your culture or your belief system that must justify itself, but that you must justify these beliefs, right? So the idea that you have to determine what you believe and explain yourself is another kind of leap in thinking. So you can step back and look at truth and belief and justification in a really beautiful way. It's really simple, because it means that, of course, we take what we see and think to be true. And that's what I mentioned as sort of an inherent mysterious quality of truth. Of course we assume it's true, but the evolution in thought can be imagined as one that leads to the emergence of belief, which is that you create a proposition or a belief, that you have certain sort of reflexivity or free will in regards to what you believe to be true. That in itself is perhaps related to a kind of reflexivity that itself is probably related to, in regards to the history of knowledge, what is called the cognitive revolution, which is the emergence of self-awareness in Homo sapiens some 30,000 to 70,000 years ago, a period within which knowledge itself, as a function of our cognition, as a function of culture, began to emerge. And so it's funny how we are so inundated with knowledge, with knowing, that we take it for granted and we're almost drowning in it, as I said. But the very birth of it kind of meant something else. And the birth of it really meant a kind of control, a kind of power over your environment and over other people. The birth of knowledge, that is. And knowledge itself emerges in Homo sapiens as memory. Memory is fundamental in knowledge. And that memory is linked to the creation of symbolic thinking, which has to do with alterations in our biomechanics, in the evolution of our larynx, for instance, in changes in our biomechanics that allowed us to make particular sounds and therefore to connect this emergent in cognition to culture itself. And as I said, that is built on memory, but memory specifically has to do with mapping terrain, with remembering areas, with remembering seasons. And ultimately, it also has to do with not just spatial things, but with thinking about the past and the future. So knowledge is spatial in regards to sites, to places that in many ways would become sacred over time. So even the sacred is related to knowledge. But also we tend to think about the future, especially given that agriculture made us temporal creatures, where we became obsessed with the future because we never knew what the next season might mean. And we also became obsessed with the past because in many regards we were haunted by our own guilt. And what you find is that knowledge itself would then emerge very distinctly within informational societies. And the control over information, as well as power, will be the twin pillars, like in a centralized civilization. And of course, power is understood, like anybody can act with power, but the control over information, over what counts as knowledge, is itself another kind of vital force that can be easily overlooked. And that's why you yourself, your life, your autonomy, the possibility of determining your own conditions is shaped by what you take for granted as being true and being believable. Now, the question of justification is where everything falls apart. Because although Plato assumed that a justification could be reached, the history of Western philosophy is largely a series of steps down towards the situation we're in, where it's almost the opposite of Plato. Plato was afraid of the sensory world. He was afraid of the idea that specifics and sheer sophistry would determine conditions. And yet we've gone beneath even that. You know, we live in a cynical, detached kind of culture that rejects even sensory information, almost lives without contact with sensory information. So what is knowledge from that condition, from that point of view? I think the question itself demands a certain courage to ask these questions about what knowledge is, but also a certain sense of astonishment and awe at information systems and what knowledge is. And these are merely pre-conversations towards the more interesting philosophical questions like, does God exist? What is meaning? You know, what is the mind or consciousness in relation to reality? All of these questions depend upon an investigation of the fundamental concept of knowledge. And so it's one thing to throw the cat out with the bath and to say that we don't know anything, but clearly we do. What's difficult is working out a nuanced, subtle sense of what truth it means in our lives. And so one can think that perhaps truth doesn't have a capital T, but that it's a lowercase t. And that lowercase t is determined by various degrees of veracity in an asymptotic curve in relation to their believability, their truthability, and their justification. And beginning with this question and not letting go of the courage to continue pursuing other ways of thinking about what knowledge is precisely where modern philosophy begins. And yet it's an extremely helpful way of beginning to read the key thinkers like David Hume and Descartes, as well as Kant. But it's also crucial for one's own autonomy. And so I don't think that it's detached and merely an intellectual thing. I think this kind of investigation is crucial, not as a means of determining what you want to believe, but simply getting clear about what you actually believe. Because a big part of what the philosophical project is getting clear about what you think, which we all take for granted until we're challenged. And so even having to articulate on your own what counts as justification or belief beyond what presents itself to your consciousness or through other people, that in itself is the beginning not just of philosophy itself, but the awakening of the possibility of self-enlightenment. And of course, the last thing that has to be said is that this beginning of self-enlightenment begins with a kind of enthusiasm, but it's combined with a kind of bittersweetness, especially insofar as one begins to discover how painful it is, how torturous it is, not only psychologically, but also physically, you know, because to live in the modern age and not lose your dignity, not lose your sincerity, to live intentionally in the modern era is to not turn away from these fundamental, subtle, boring questions. Like I said, it's not, can we know everything or do we know nothing, right? That's too easy, because clearly we don't know everything. Nobody has access to absolutes. Nobody has certainty. But is it true that nobody knows anything or that everybody just has their opinion? That's not true either. So seeing that one is in a very tricky position at first, and then a position that one later discovers is something that one has to dance with, that you have to learn how to maneuver in a way that has much more in common with music than it does with mathematics. And so I think that seeing that there's a beautiful kind of sweetness that comes through this discipline, which in many ways means being loyal to the Western philosophical tradition by at least reading the fundamental books, taking the fundamental ideas and questions seriously, and seeing that one's ideas are existentially related to one's own life, and that in investigating one's own ideas, one is investigating one's own self. And it's very hip, I hear, to be meta, to be meta. And what could be more meta than the conceptual analysis of concepts themselves? What is a concept? What is knowledge? If you have a taste for that, or you see a purpose to it, then you are perhaps a philosopher. And I'm John Edward Willey. I love you all.